All right, so before we get started here, many of you are already aware that my son Max was in a pretty serious motorcycle accident on Friday. It's not life-threatening, didn't injure his head or his spine, but it did a great deal of damage to his left leg and hip. And I've been really grateful. Many of you have reached out and been super kind to me about that, and to Kelly and to Max, and we love you, and we love to live in the great cataract of your love. However, for the next 4 hours, I have a lot of really important things to do that are very near and dear to my heart, things that I would love to communicate and engage with you on. And I find my compartmentalization skills are finite. So the kindest thing you can do for me for the next few hours is just leave me alone. It's just not that helpful to have 400 conversations about Max, if you understand. And if you don't understand, it's okay, but just do it anyway, all right? So we're going to be in Zechariah, you guys. If you're new here, or if you haven't been here the last few weeks, we're in the midst of a 6-part series on the book of Zechariah, which I just am so excited about. I have loved. I hope you love it. We really want you to understand this book. Zechariah is what we call a post-exilic prophet. And what that means is he writes very late in the story of Israel. He writes post-exile after this really, really dreadful judgment. Israel had been in rebellion basically for centuries, and God finally has warned and warned and warned through the prophets that a judgment is coming. Israel doesn't heed, and he brings in a really brutal man named Nebuchadnezzar, the leader of Babylon, and they punish Israel severely. They put them into a 70-year captivity, and after that captivity, when the judgment is over and the Israelites are allowed to return, there's a remnant, and they are dazed, defeated, and demoralized. And they want to know, are they also discarded? Is it over for us? Will the Messiah still come? And Zechariah speaks into that. And through a series of images, really pretty bizarre to us, he explores the question, is the Messiah still going to come? Or are we done? And his answer is, it's not over. The Messiah is still coming. And it is not too late for you to end your rebellion and to come under his gracious protection. In fact, Zechariah talks so much about the Messiah that the New Testament quotes his book 70 times, which is extraordinary given what a short little book it is. It is incredibly important, but it's not very well known. And so what Sloop and Quig and I are hoping to do for you over this span is just kind of light the book up for you so that you might be able to discover its treasures. And this morning's passage that you just heard read contains what I would guess is probably the most well-known line in Zechariah, right? It's the bit, don't you think? It's the bit about the king on a donkey. You know it because Matthew and Mark both quote it in describing what we call the triumphal entry. It's when Jesus came into Jerusalem a week before he was crucified. It's what we celebrate on Palm Sunday. We will celebrate Palm Sunday, not today, but in about 8 weeks. And when we do, I hope that you'll be like, oh, I know this one, right? You'll have a lot more background information. But this morning, we're going to jump in at Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And I should remind you, or should mention, if you haven't been here, on the way out, if you come down this little curvy hall thing right here, this little pseudo hall, on the left, you'll find a bunch of Zechariah books. I printed the text up for you, including all the New Testament allusions. And we just love you to have a copy of that as you read it, because we really would love to be a church that understands this book. But here we are, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. It says this, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, this is an extraordinary promise, and it cuts to the absolute heart of this book. And I want to try to explain to you why that is and what's going on here. Zechariah is describing a coming king, right? And what he does, he invokes a donkey, which is familiar language to us, but the root of that might not be, okay? So to understand what it really means, we're going to need to go on a little bit of a detour again, like we did a few weeks ago, and go all the way back to Genesis and kind of build our way up to understand where we are, okay? So if you go back to Genesis, remember that Adam was placed, I'm probably going to stay on camera here. Adam was placed in a garden, okay? And when he was in that garden, he was himself both king and priest, okay? It would take too long to really fully develop this, but just very briefly, you recall that he was given creation to rule, right? He would rule over every living creature, subdue it, and rule over every living creature. That's because he was king. And he was priest. We know that he was priest because the garden was a temple. The garden was where God dwelt with man. It was where the first sacrifice was offered. Even all the later subsequent temples are going to be modeled after the garden. That's why there's pomegranates and palm trees there, in the temples. They're pointing back to Eden. And you can believe me or not believe me, but it's true, okay? And I just don't have time to fully persuade you. He was king and priest there in the garden. But he did not do a good job. He wasn't a very good king. He wasn't a very good priest. The throne ends up being usurped by a serpent. And the priest comes to need a priest. He needs someone who will come and stand between he and God. And history has shown that we don't make very good kings. And we don't make very good priests. And there ain't nobody any good at being both. And so God divided up the roles. There would be some who would be kings. There would be others who would be priests. And until the Messiah comes, who can actually, finally, do both, we would have a separation of powers, so to speak. So, in the providence of God, he determined to create a nation from one man, Abraham. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. And God decided that the kings of Israel would come from Jacob's son, Judah. And the priests of Israel would come from Jacob's son, Levi. It was, as I say, a temporary division. The plan all along was one day to reunify the kings and the priests, right? That was actually the subject of last week's passage in Zechariah 6, that one man would come who would be both king and priest. He would finally do what Adam couldn't do. And today, we're going to focus just on the king side of that equation, okay? In order to do that, we need to look at the promise that the kings would come from Judah. Now, does anybody know where that is in Genesis? When I say the kings come from Judah, I'm not making that up. What's the source of that? Do you guys know? Very close to 50. It's 49, right at the very end. So in Genesis 49, Abraham is giving promises to each one of his sons. He's kind of speaking a blessing, sometimes a curse, but generally a blessing over these 12 kids. And this is what he says to Judah. This is Genesis 49. We'll pick it up in verse 8. He says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down, like a lioness who dares to rouse him. If you've ever heard Jesus referred to as the Lion of Judah, this is that. This is the root of that. But take a look at verse 10. It says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come. And the obedience of the nations, plural, shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. Okay, right there in the middle of Genesis 49:10 is the heart of this promise, okay? The scepter would not depart from Judah, meaning from Judah would come all of the kings. The scepter will not be king after king after king after king, right? They're going to hold it. They're going to have the power. They're going to maintain it. But they're going to rule temporarily, and they're going to rule just over Israel. They're little kings. They're not big kings. They're not the big king. They're going to hold the throne. They're going to hold the crown. They're going to hold the scepter and rule temporarily until the true king comes, to whom it all belongs. And to him, it won't just be that Israel will be obedient, but the nations will become his. Take a look at verse 10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come. And the obedience of the nations shall be his. So they hold the scepter until the real king comes, and the obedience of the nations is his. You with me? Now, you may notice too that he will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. We'll have more on that in a minute. But the people of Zechariah would have known this. This was a big one. They knew this promise. And when they heard Zechariah 9, they would have heard in it Genesis 49:10. No question. This is the basis of the promise of Zechariah 9. Make sense? You with me? Okay. Now, they knew it was this, and they knew when they heard Zechariah 9 that what this means is the king is still, this king is still coming. It's not over yet. And that was really, really good news and it would have been a huge relief to them. It should have caused them to rejoice. And I wonder if it's obvious why. Okay? Think about the nature of this promise. The promise was they would all be this unbroken chain of little kings until the Messiah came. But the chain was broken, unmistakably broken. The little kings had all been benched. And I wonder if you've ever noticed that. Genesis 49 says, little king will hold the throne, little king will hold the throne, little king will finally offer his scepter to the real king. That's the limit of my artfulness. Do you like it? Okay? This is how it's supposed to go. But what actually ends up, think about this. Who was the king of Israel when the Messiah finally came? No one. There was no king of Israel, right? This promise here was set aside. But if you look at this promise actually has two parts. Part one is that the little kings would hold the throne the whole time, right? There'd always be a little Judean king over Israel, and the scepter would not depart from him. And then part two was that one day the real king would come, and he would rule over the whole world, right? They were holding the little scepters until the real king came. But you guys, part one was set aside explicitly. You can't tell. Can you tell? Those are crossed out, okay? Part one was set aside. This is described in unmistakable language in a place that might seem obscure to you, but should have been known by them in Ezekiel chapter 21. I'll throw it on screen. Listen to Ezekiel 21, but as you do, hear Genesis 49. Have that in your ears, okay? Because Ezekiel 21 is talking about Genesis 49. It is the link to this. Here's what it says. O profane and wicked prince of Israel, whose day has come, whose time of punishment has reached its climax. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Take off the turban, remove the crown. It will not be as it was. The lowly will be exalted, and the exalted will be brought low. A ruin, I will make it a ruin. And here it is. It will not be restored until he comes to whom it rightfully belongs. To him I will give it. Do you hear that? No more turban, no more crown. The symbols of kingship represented as scepter in Genesis 49 have been taken away. You are done. You are benched. And there will be no more kings. Sit down, you wicked and profane princes. But do you also hear the second part being reaffirmed? A ruin, I will make it a ruin, and it will not be restored until he comes to whom it rightfully belongs. To him I will give it. Judah lost the right to pass the throne to the Messiah, but the Messiah is still coming, and God will give him his throne himself. There will be centuries of empty throne prior to his arrival, but it's not over yet. He is still coming. Make sense? That's what's happening. That's what they're reading. That's what they're experiencing in Zechariah 9. Now, the question here is, what is he like? Go back to Zechariah 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. He is coming. He is coming. It's not over yet, so rejoice. But the question that will remain in their mind is, but what's he going to be like? Will he still be kind? Or have we earned ourselves a harsh king? Is he still king on a donkey? And to answer that question, I want to look to my favorite Clint Eastwood movie, which perhaps some of you have seen. Has anybody seen Gran Torino? It's been a while. It's a fantastic movie. It is not, however, sanctuary safe, so we're going to describe it. In the movie, Clint Eastwood plays a man named Mr. Kowalski, and he is a grouchy, old, racist man. He fought in Korea, and he lives in a neighborhood where he raised his family, but his wife has died, and all of the white people have moved out of his neighborhood, and all of the immigrants have moved in, and he does not like it. And as the story unfolds, he begrudgingly befriends one particular family, including their teenage son and daughter, Tao and Sue. And while he never really stops being grouchy or racist, he does love them. And the climax of the movie comes after Sue is brutally assaulted by a gang. It's a incredibly difficult moment in the movie for Sue, and really for everyone in the neighborhood, and for Mr. Kowalski, because he has really genuinely come to love this family. And everyone is living in fear of this gang of thugs that have taken the neighborhood to make it their own. As I said, it would be hard to clean up. I would love to show you this scene, but it would be impossible to. So I want to describe it to you, but as I do, I want you to remember, I want you to have Zechariah 9 in your mind before we actually go to the film. And I want you to notice the complex picture of what this coming king will be like. Here's what he says. He says, see, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He is righteous and victorious, and he is lowly on a donkey. And those are somewhat different things. As Zechariah 9 goes on, Zechariah depicts this king is going to take away all the chariots and the war horses, the battle bows. Those are things, you guys, that are generally accomplished by force, by might, by the raw exercise of power. And so it's a strange thing that this king is going to be lowly and gentle. And perhaps even stranger is that Zechariah throws this line in here in verse 11 that his work will be fueled by, quote, the blood of his covenant. Verse 11, as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Okay? So with all that in mind, in Gran Torino, there is no peace. The neighborhood is terrorized by this gang of thugs, and the family that Mr. Kowalski loves is particularly terrorized by them. Now, in a typical Eastwood flick, the solution is pretty straightforward. You just roll into town and kill everybody, right? And then you and we leave the theater just rejoicing in his power and his might that the wicked have been put down. But not this time. In this particular scene, what's going to happen is Kowalski goes to the home where the gang members are all living. And he stands in the street and he loudly rebukes them. He just calls them out. They're all standing on the porch and they're all fully armed and they are sneering at him and swearing at him. And he just calls them out for their evil. And the neighbors are all there. Everybody's kind of gathered and they're all watching as he just tells them the truth about their wickedness. He's highly confrontational. And then he pulls out a cigarette, an unlit cigarette. And then he reaches into his breast pocket to get a lighter. But he knows that when he does that, they will misinterpret the move as if he's going for his gun. And they, in anticipation of that, will gun him down, which they do. And in about 5 seconds, he gets shot about 40 times, and he falls to the ground dead. And in that moment, he defeated them utterly. They didn't know it, but as they struck his head, or as they struck his heel, he crushed their head because they shot and killed an unarmed man in front of the entire neighborhood. And therefore, those gang members were all arrested and taken out of that neighborhood so there could finally be peace. He won by losing. And he gave his life. He gave his blood and a certain sort of covenant for the ones that he loved. Now, Eastwood not only starred in Gran Torino, but he directed it, he produced it. And as I watched the scene, I was wondering, does he know what he is doing? Does he understand that the inspiration of this scene is the self-sacrificial cross of Christ, who also won by losing, who defeated Satan, freeing his people by allowing himself to be killed. Let's darken the room. I want you to see about the only 30 seconds of this movie that we could show here as Kowalski falls to the ground. So Brian, if you can make it nice and dark. This is a dark scene. It's just hard to see it if we don't kill as much light as we can. I want you to see this. Can we kill these? Is that possible? You guys, stop. I'm serious about the light. Is that not possible? And if you can back that up, Deanna, you're not going to be able to see it, and I do not want these lights washing the screen. So can these ones not be killed? Okay, so back it up and do it again. I'm sorry. You won't be able to see it if we don't. Do you think he knew? He lies on his back with his arms outstretched, blood pouring from his wrists. Clint Eastwood knew exactly what he was doing, and I'm pretty sure he wanted you to know it too. You guys, stories like this captivate us because built into our hearts is the ability to recognize that the gospel story is the story behind every story. Every good story has to borrow its themes in some way from the story of the crucified one. Jesus quotes this moment in Zechariah when he served the disciples the Last Supper, right? But he changed it ever so slightly. In Zechariah, God spoke of, quote, the blood of my covenant, which is an allusion to Exodus 24. But when Jesus quotes it, he brings it forward and he nails it unmistakably to his cross. And he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. You guys, Jesus is the righteous and victorious King. The one to whom the throne rightfully belongs has come, and the very cosmos have been given to him to rule. He earned it, but he earned it through lowliness. His weakness was his strength, his folly was his wisdom, and he went to the lowest place. And therefore, he was exalted to the highest place. He is the fulfillment of Genesis 49. He is the fulfillment of Ezekiel 21. He is the righteous, victorious, lowly king on a donkey in Zechariah 9. He is the king. And he leads a kingdom that is governed by mercy and love, by sacrifice and by kindness. And I wonder, is he your king? He invites you to come out of the domain of darkness and into his kingdom of light. And you can come right now, and it can all be yours. Every week we set aside this time. The rails that are curved here are for you to come alone to meet with him. At the straight rails, we'll have friends that can pray with you and be kind to you there. And you can come now, and it can all be yours, but I will warn you that everything is upside down here. In Jesus' kingdom, the first are last and the last are first. We win by losing, and we gain by giving up everything. Our time, our talent, our treasure are spent for the good of others. We admit it when we're wrong. We apologize, we make restitution, and we consider our needs, others' needs, as more important than our own. It is a strange kingdom, but oh, what a king we have. He is rich in mercy. He is great in power, and in him is met the admirable conjunction of diverse excellencies, meaning he is highly exalted, and and he dwells with the lowly. He's a roaring lion. He's a gentle lamb. He is infinitely worthy of good and infinitely patient in suffering evil. And I exhort you today, if you never have, bend the knee before his absolute supremacy. Come into his kingdom. He gave everything because he loves you. Lord Jesus, we thank you that the promise was ultimately kept and that the King has come. We love you. We exalt you. Lord, I pray for any here that would not be confident that they are under your reign, that your kindness and your gentleness and your ferocious power are all for them, that this would be the day you'd flip it all, that we would all live under your kind and gracious protection. We love you. Thanks for loving us.